The night was particularly dark, with thick clouds blocking any trace of moonlight. Rain lashed violently against the windshield of John's car as he cautiously drove along a winding road, trying to focus on the road ahead despite his mind being elsewhere. The business meeting he had just left had been exhausting but promising. The discussions about expanding his company were finally taking shape. However, something still troubled him, a nagging feeling that there was more behind his partner's recent attitudes than he could perceive. As his thoughts wandered, a strange noise caught his attention. The brakes. He pressed the pedal hard, but nothing happened. The car started accelerating, gaining speed uncontrollably. His heart raced, and he tried to stay calm, desperately steering the wheel, but the tires were already skidding on the wet asphalt. The screeching of the tires echoed through the empty road as the car crashed into the guardrail. The violent impact caused the vehicle to roll several times before finally coming to a stop, upside down at the bottom of a ravine. The rain continued to pour relentlessly, washing over the broken glass and mingling with the smell of gasoline that began to spread in the air. John was unconscious, his mind plunged into darkness. But as flashes of memory flickered through his mind, the scenes from that night tormented him. The cold smile of Charles, his main business partner, the calculated distance in the gaze of his wife, Mary. Something was very wrong. Now he understood. This hadn't been an accident. Hours passed before a man driving by noticed the trail of destruction and spotted the car. As he approached, he saw that John was still breathing, though severely injured. With difficulty, the man dragged John out of the wreckage and rushed him to a nearby hospital, where his life depended on immediate interventions. As John's body fought between life and death, the world around him moved on as if he had already passed away. Days at the hospital passed slowly. John floated between consciousness and emptiness, his body struggling to recover. When he finally opened his eyes, weeks had passed, but his mind was still foggy. The first thing he noticed were the deep scars on his body, and shortly after, the absence of any family or friends by his side. That was when a doctor entered the room. "You're a lucky man," the doctor said quietly. "If they had found you a few minutes later, you wouldn't be here." The words echoed in John's mind as he tried to grasp what had happened. It hadn't been luck. They had left him to die. But why? As he slowly recovered, John was discharged. But instead of returning to his previous life, he made a crucial decision. He would disappear. His instincts led him to a remote town, where he could heal physically and emotionally without the risk of being found by those who wanted him dead. In the months that followed, he kept a distant eye on the events of his former life. From the few news snippets he managed to catch, he learned that his wife, Mary, and his partner, Charles, had quickly taken control of the company, acting as if his death had been an inevitability. The initial shock was replaced by a cold determination. They had betrayed him, planned his death, and now they were thriving in his absence. John knew he couldn't return immediately. His scars, both physical and emotional, needed time to heal. He spent hours planning, replaying every detail of the accident and the signs of betrayal that now seemed so obvious. However, something deeper grew within him. It wasn't just anger. It was the certainty that he couldn't let this go unpunished. John, once a fair and compassionate businessman, was beginning to transform. His new mission was clear. He would return to the city, but not as the victim they expected. He would return as someone ruthless, ready to expose everyone who had betrayed him. 3 years had passed since the accident. John had completely transformed, both physically and mentally. His physical scars had healed, though they were still visible on his skin, a constant reminder of the betrayal he had suffered. However, it was the internal scars that had truly shaped the man he had become. There was no longer room for trust or innocence in his heart. All that remained was an unwavering determination to seek justice by his own hands. He arrived in the city as a stranger. His longer hair and dense beard made him unrecognizable, while his sunglasses hid his eyes. John had meticulously planned every detail. Under a false identity, he assumed the role of a new investor interested in the company he had founded, now in the hands of Charles and Mary. The city had changed, but the gleam of big corporations and the frantic pace of business hadn't. As John walked through the streets, he felt a mix of nostalgia and bitterness. This had been his life, his legacy, and now it was being tarnished by the people he had once trusted the most. As he approached the building that housed his former company, John noticed the large glass facade, now adorned with a slightly altered logo. It was as if Charles had wanted to erase any trace of John's past. But this didn't intimidate him. In fact, it fueled his desire to proceed with his plan. Stepping into the building, John took a deep breath. No one recognized him, which was exactly what he wanted. His first objective was to gather information. He needed to discover how much Charles and Mary had profited from his absence and how far they were willing to go to keep their lies intact. He knew he had to move carefully, but the first phase of his plan was underway: infiltrate the company and closely observe the movements of his enemies. The days that followed were a mixture of tension and patience. John observed every detail, every interaction between Charles and Mary, while keeping himself in the shadows, disguised as a potential investor interested in acquiring part of the company. He avoided any direct contact with Mary, fearing that she might, in some way, sense that something was wrong. But at the same time, he wanted to know just how deep her betrayal went. It was during one of these meetings that John uncovered the full extent of the deception. He stumbled upon documents that not only proved the accident had been premeditated, but also showed that Charles and Mary were involved in a fraudulent scheme that was slowly draining the company. They were using the name and reputation that John had built to cover up their illegal activities, all while enriching themselves at the expense of others. The rage John felt as he read through those documents was overwhelming. He knew Charles was capable of betrayal, but he had still harbored hope that Mary might have been a victim in all this. However, the evidence was clear. She had been involved from the very beginning, working alongside Charles on every decision. John was now faced with the brutal truth that the woman he had once loved not only allowed them to try to kill him but also benefited from his absence. Each page he read, each detail he uncovered, only strengthened the hatred growing inside him. Now, it wasn't just about exposing Charles and Mary publicly. John wanted to destroy them in the same way they had tried to destroy him. He spent sleepless nights planning his next steps. There would be no more mercy. In his eyes, they had become monsters, and he wouldn't hesitate to tear down everything they had built on the ruins of his life. Yet one question continuously haunted him. When the moment came, would he be able to confront Mary face to face? The doubt about his next move loomed larger with each passing day, and John knew that his return to the city was just the beginning of the storm he was about to unleash. John was ready to take the first step toward his revenge. He had gathered enough evidence to begin dismantling the corrupt empire that Charles and Mary had built upon his supposed death. However, his desire for justice was accompanied by an emotional dilemma. Part of him still hesitated to act directly against Mary, though he knew she was not innocent. His first move was to send an anonymous dossier to the police, detailing the financial frauds Charles had been orchestrating within the company. The evidence was clear, irrefutable, and John knew it would trigger an immediate investigation. His plan was simple: to bring Charles down piece by piece, driving him into desperation as he lost control of the situation. At the same time, John decided to approach Mary in disguise, using his new identity. He needed to understand just how deeply she was involved and whether there was any sign of remorse or regret. During a casual meeting, Mary appeared just as she always had, confident, calculating, and completely immersed in the new life of power she had gained. John felt a sharp pain realizing that the woman he once loved no longer existed, if she ever had. The interactions with Mary only reinforced his resolve. There was no longer any doubt about what he needed to do. The justice he once sought was no longer enough. He wanted vengeance, and Charles and Mary would pay dearly for what they had done. Nevertheless, John knew he had to proceed cautiously, waiting for the right moment to strike with full force. The second phase of John's plan was now in motion. He knew Charles was greedy and blindly confident in his position of power. Using his new identity, John posed as a foreign investor interested in expanding the business ventures of Charles's company. It was a trap, carefully laid to make Charles reveal his illicit activities. The meeting was scheduled at an upscale restaurant, far from prying eyes. John had ensured that everything was ready to record the conversation without raising any suspicion. The tension in the air was palpable as Charles, with his usual smug smile, began openly discussing the shortcuts he had taken to ensure the company's success. With each word, John felt his victory draw closer. However, the unexpected arrival of Mary at the meeting caught John off guard. She walked into the restaurant a few minutes after the conversation had begun, and her presence unsettled John. Seeing her cold composure and serenity, as if nothing had ever happened, hit him in an unexpected way. His anger boiled, but he managed to maintain control. Mary sat next to Charles, seamlessly joining the conversation as if everything they were discussing was natural to her. During the meeting, Charles became increasingly candid, unaware that he was being recorded or that he was sealing his fate with his own words. John watched the scene like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. With the confession recorded, he knew he was one step away from bringing Charles down. But as John looked at Mary, something within him wavered. Even though he knew she was guilty, the thought of publicly destroying her still disturbed him. John spent the rest of the meeting battling his own emotions, wondering how far he was truly willing to go. His revenge against Charles was nearly secured, but Mary remained a weak point, a part of his past he still couldn't completely let go. As he left the restaurant, John knew that the next hours would be decisive. He had what he needed to destroy Charles, but the question of what to do about Mary continued to haunt him. The plan was in motion, but the outcome would be far more painful than he had ever anticipated. The plan was ready, and John knew it was time to deliver the final blow. He arranged a private meeting with Charles and Mary, under the pretense of a crucial negotiation for the company. The meeting would take place in a discreet office, far from the prying eyes of employees or onlookers. John mentally prepared himself for the confrontation. He knew that after this encounter, there would be no turning back. When Charles and Mary arrived, the tension in the air was palpable. They still saw John as the mysterious investor, completely unaware that they were about to face the man they had left for dead. Charles, as usual, was brimming with confidence, believing he was about to close another major deal. Mary, on the other hand, maintained her cool and calculating demeanor, showing no signs of doubt. John, sitting across from them, took a deep breath and removed the sunglasses that had concealed part of his face. The silence that followed was deafening. The shock on Charles and Mary's faces was immediate. Charles took a step back, his face pale, while Mary froze, her eyes wide as if she were seeing a ghost. "I told you I'd be back." John's words were cold, laced with years of contained fury. Charles, still in shock, tried to stammer something but couldn't form any coherent words. Mary, finally regaining her voice, attempted to explain. "John, we thought you were dead." But John knew the truth. He had seen the documents, heard the confessions. He knew it wasn't an accident, nor a misunderstanding. They had left him to die, and now they were reaping the rewards of their betrayal. In a desperate move, Charles lunged toward John. The tension spiked, and a physical confrontation seemed inevitable. With a quick motion, John immobilized Charles, his years of pent-up rage giving him the strength to hold him down. The fury John felt toward him was overwhelming, and he was seconds away from losing all control. Mary screamed, begging them to stop, but John was no longer willing to listen. The confrontation quickly spiraled out of control. Charles, driven by desperation, struggled to free himself from John's grip, but the force of years of anger was enough to keep him pinned to the ground. Mary, panicking, didn't know how to react. Everything seemed to be unraveling fast. But John had not planned just this encounter. He had already alerted the authorities about the corruption scheme Charles had been running, and he knew the police were on their way. As Charles finally seemed ready to surrender, the sound of sirens echoed from outside. The office door burst open, and police officers stormed in, arresting Charles before he could make another move. Mary, shocked and disoriented, looked around in disbelief. Her mask of confidence and power had fallen completely. She was just as entangled in the scheme as Charles, and that was about to be revealed. Charles was handcuffed and escorted out by the police, while Mary was questioned on the spot. She tried desperately to justify her actions, but the evidence against her was damning. John watched the scene in silence. The plan had worked. Charles and Mary were ruined, and the company that had once been his would be saved from the imminent collapse they had driven it toward. However, as John watched Charles being taken away, an unexpected feeling washed over him. There was no satisfaction. The revenge he had carefully planned didn't bring the relief he had imagined. All he felt was emptiness, as if the weight of everything that had happened still lingered on his shoulders. He had won, but at what cost? Mary, now alone, looked at John with tears in her eyes. "Why did you do this?" she asked, her voice trembling with desperation. But John didn't answer. He knew there were no more words to say. The past was dead, just like the relationship he once thought he had with her. Now all that remained was to move forward. The sound of the sirens faded as night fell over the city. John remained still, watching as the world continued turning around him. He had done what needed to be done, but now, in the silence that followed, there was only emptiness. The revenge he had so meticulously planned hadn't brought the peace he had hoped for. Deep down, John knew that the deepest wounds, the ones rooted in betrayal, would never fully heal. He left the building in silence, avoiding the commotion caused by Charles's arrest and Mary's public downfall. The streets of the city that had once been his home now felt distant, cold. Every corner, every building held memories of a time when he believed he had control over his life and his business. But those days were long gone, destroyed by the accident and the betrayal that followed. John wandered aimlessly for hours, reflecting on everything that had happened. He had left his old life behind 3 years earlier, believing he could return and correct the injustices. But after obtaining the revenge he had so long desired, he realized there was nothing left for him in this city. The man he had been before the accident, full of ambition and optimism, was gone. All that remained was a tired man, ready to start over somewhere far away from everything and everyone. As the sun began to rise, John made a decision. He would leave the city forever. There was no longer any reason to stay. What had tied him to this place had been destroyed, and he was finally free, though that freedom came with the weight of a bitter loneliness. A few months had passed since the final confrontation with Charles and Mary. John had settled in a small coastal town, far from the life he once knew. He lived simply, without the pressures and complications of the corporate world. The days were quiet, but the emptiness still lingered, like a shadow that refused to leave. Slowly, John began to reconnect with his humanity, finding small moments of peace in the simplest things. A morning walk on the beach, the sound of the waves gently breaking on the shore, or a casual conversation with the local townspeople who had no idea who he was or what he had been through. Yet, despite his attempts to start anew, John knew he would never be the same. The scars, both physical and emotional, were ever present, reminding him of the man he had been and what he had lost along the way. Over time, he began to realize that while the past could not be erased, he still had a chance to move forward. Each day was an opportunity to find a bit of peace, though the process was slow and painful. Still, something continued to gnaw at him. Even in his new life, far from everything, John felt as though something was watching him from a distance. A vague presence he couldn't quite define. Perhaps it was just the weight of the past that he hadn't fully left behind. Or maybe there was something else lurking, a shadow of his former enemies that might resurface in the future. But for now, John chose to live in the present, trying to rebuild himself piece by piece. The future was uncertain, but he was willing to face it, one day at a time.